Sometimes the greatest acts of kindness come from the loneliest hearts. When grief has hollowed you out, leaving behind only the echo of what once was, a single moment of compassion can change everything. Ben Carver had been alone on his Montana ranch for 3 years, ever since his wife passed. The silence had become his companion, the empty horse stalls, a reminder of dreams that died with her. But one evening, fate brought him a wounded mustang collapsed by his water trough. Without hesitation, Ben knelt beside the suffering animal, offering water and gentle words he hadn't spoken in years. At dawn, something extraordinary happened that would transform his life forever. But what could move an entire wild herd to surround one man's ranch? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, please subscribe, because tomorrow I've saved something truly special. The morning light crept across the Bitterroot Valley like an old friend who'd forgotten how to knock. Ben Carver stood at his kitchen window, watching the shadows retreat from the pastures that stretched toward the distant peaks. His coffee had gone cold in his hands, a habit he'd developed over the past 3 years, getting lost in the landscape that once held so much promise. On the counter behind him, a simple gold band caught the early sunlight. Each morning, Ben would slip it off his finger and set it there, unable to wear it through the day's work, but equally unable to put it away. Martha's ring had been buried with her, but his remained, a daily reminder of vows that death had interrupted but never truly broken. The kitchen still smelled faintly of her lavender soap, though he knew that was impossible. Some mornings, he could almost hear her humming while she prepared breakfast, the way she'd done for 32 years of marriage. The way she'd done right up until that last morning, when the cancer finally claimed what the treatments couldn't save. Ben set his mug down and picked up the ring, rolling it between weathered fingers. The inscription inside had worn smooth, "Forever, M." She'd been practical about everything except love. Even picking out their wedding bands, she'd insisted on something simple, saying they'd need the money for the ranch. The horses, she'd said, their future. He slipped the ring back onto his finger and stepped outside onto the wraparound porch they'd built together, the 2nd year of their marriage. The boards creaked under his weight. 70 years of Montana winters and summers had left their mark on everything, including him. But the view hadn't changed. Rolling grassland stretched for miles, punctuated by copses of cottonwood and aspen that turned gold each fall, like nature's own celebration. Martha had loved this view. She'd sit right here in her wicker chair, still there collecting dust, and plan out their days. Which pasture to rotate the horses to, which fences needed mending, which foals showed the most promise. She'd had an eye for horses that bordered on mystical. Ben was the trainer, but Martha was the one who could spot a champion in a gangly yearling that looked like it might trip over its own hooves. The Carver Ranch had been something special once. Not the biggest spread in the valley, but one of the most respected. They'd specialized in quarter horses, breeding, training, and selling animals that ranchers across 3 states sought out. Ben had learned from his father, who'd learned from his father before him. 3 generations of Carver men who understood that working with horses wasn't about dominance, it was about partnership. Martha had understood that better than anyone. She'd grown up on a neighboring ranch, daughter of a man who believed horses were tools to be broken rather than partners to be earned. When she married Ben, she'd said it felt like coming home to a language she'd always known but never heard spoken aloud. Their first horse together had been a rescue, a mustang mare. Someone had caught wild and tried to break with harsh methods. The animal had been half-starved, skittish, and mean as a cornered cat. Most people would have given up, but Martha had seen something in the mare's eyes. Trust wasn't dead, she'd said, just buried deep. It took them 6 months to earn that mare's friendship. 6 months of patient approaches, gentle touches, and countless hours of simply being present without demanding anything. When she finally allowed them to slip a halter over her head, Martha had cried. That mare became the foundation of their breeding program. 13 foals over her lifetime, each one carrying her intelligence and spirit. Ben walked to the edge of the porch and leaned against the railing. The barn stood about 50 yards away, its red paint faded to rust brown. Inside, empty stalls waited for horses that would never come. After Martha's funeral, Ben had sold their entire herd. He'd told himself it was practical. He couldn't manage alone what had taken 2 people to build. But the truth was simpler and more painful. Every horse reminded him of her. The neighboring ranches had changed hands twice since Martha's passing. Young families moving in from back east, drawn by some romantic notion of Montana life that rarely survived their first winter. They'd waved from their trucks when they passed on the county road, but Ben never waved back. Politeness required energy he didn't have to spare. Dr. Helen Rodriguez, the veterinarian who'd served the valley for 20 years, still stopped by occasionally. She'd known Martha well. They'd worked together on difficult births and tricky medical cases. Helen would bring coffee and conversation, trying to coax Ben back toward the world of the living. But her visits had grown less frequent as his responses grew more monosyllabic. "You can't grieve forever, Ben," she'd said during her last visit 6 months ago. "Martha wouldn't want this for you." He'd thanked her for the coffee and walked her to her truck without another word. Martha wouldn't want this, he knew that. She'd want him to find his way back to the horses, back to the land they'd loved together. But wanting something and being capable of it were entirely different creatures. The truth was, Ben had forgotten how to be around people. 3 years of solitude had turned social interaction into something foreign and exhausting. Even simple transactions at the feed store in town became ordeals he'd put off until necessity forced his hand. The young clerk would try to make small talk, and Ben would find himself searching for words that used to come naturally. He spent his days maintaining the ranch infrastructure, mending fences that no longer held livestock, repairing buildings that housed only memories. The work kept his hands busy and his mind occupied, but it felt like tending a grave rather than nurturing something alive. The water trough near the barn had become his one concession to the possibility of life returning. He cleaned it weekly and kept it full, telling himself it was for the occasional deer or elk that wandered down from the hills. But sometimes, in his more honest moments, he wondered if he was keeping it ready for something else. Some sign that the partnership he'd shared with Martha, with the horses, with the land itself, might still have room for him. Evenings were the hardest. That's when the silence grew teeth, and the empty house felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. He'd taken to staying outside until full darkness, sometimes falling asleep in Martha's chair with a blanket pulled over his shoulders. The night sounds of the valley, owls calling, coyotes singing in the distance, the whisper of wind through grass, were easier company than the echoes that lived inside the house. Tonight would be different, though he didn't know it yet. Tonight, the water trough he'd maintained out of habit and hope would finally serve its purpose. Tonight, a creature as wounded and isolated as he was would collapse beside it, and Ben would discover that his capacity for compassion hadn't died with his wife. It had simply been waiting for someone who needed it as much as he did. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that Martha had always said looked like watercolors bleeding into wet paper. Ben stood on his porch, wedding ring heavy on his finger, and watched another day prepare to end. In a few hours, everything would change. But for now, he was still just a man alone with his grief, tending a ranch that had forgotten how to be alive. The first thing Ben noticed was the stillness. Not the peaceful quiet of evening settling over the valley, but something more deliberate, the kind of silence that meant something wild was nearby. And everything else was holding its breath. He'd been checking the barn doors before heading inside, part of a routine that had become as automatic as breathing. The sun had dropped behind the western peaks, leaving the sky painted in deep purples and golds. That's when he heard it, a soft whicker, barely audible, coming from near the water trough. Ben froze, his hand still on the barn door latch. In 3 years of solitude, no animal larger than a raccoon had visited his property. He turned slowly, scanning the darkening yard, until his eyes found the source of the sound. A horse lay crumpled beside the stone water trough, its dark coat barely distinguishable from the gathering shadows. Even from a distance, Ben could see the animal's labored breathing, the unnatural angle of its left foreleg. This wasn't a domestic horse that had wandered off from a neighboring ranch. The proportions were all wrong, too compact, too wild. This was a mustang. For a moment, Ben stood paralyzed between instinct and self-preservation. He'd been alone for so long that even this unexpected encounter with a suffering animal felt overwhelming. Part of him wanted to retreat to the house, to pretend he hadn't seen anything, let nature take its course. That's what he'd been doing with his own life for 3 years. But then the horse tried to lift its head toward the water, and something in that simple, desperate movement shattered the wall Ben had built around his heart. He moved forward slowly, speaking in the low, gentle tones that had once been second nature. "Easy there, friend. Easy now." The words felt rusty in his throat, but they came back like muscle memory returning to an old athlete. The Mustang's eye rolled toward him, a wild, frightened thing full of pain but not yet resigned to death. Ben had seen that look before, in animals and in his own reflection, during the darkest days after Martha's funeral. It was the look of something that wanted to live, but didn't know how to ask for help. "I'm not going to hurt you," Ben whispered, dropping to one knee about 6 feet from the injured animal. "Just want to take a look." The horse was a stallion, probably 8 or 9 years old, with the sturdy build and intelligent eyes that marked him as a leader. His dark bay coat was matted with sweat and dust, and his left front leg bore an ugly gash just above the fetlock. The wound was fresh, but not bleeding heavily, probably sustained in a fall or confrontation with barbed wire. What struck Ben most was the animal's dignity. Despite his obvious pain and vulnerability, the stallion held his head with the proud bearing of something that had never been conquered. This was no broken-down ranch horse. This was wild royalty, temporarily defeated but not diminished. Ben rose slowly and walked to the barn, returning with an old leather halter and a first-aid kit he hadn't touched in 3 years. The stallion watched his every movement but didn't try to rise, whether from injury or some deeper wisdom. Ben couldn't tell. Martha always said trust was earned, not taken, Ben said, settling cross-legged on the ground just beyond the horse's reach. "Guess we'll have to start there." He opened the first aid kit and laid out supplies, antiseptic, bandages, pain medication left over from when his own arthritis had been at its worst. The ritual of preparation felt familiar, awakening knowledge he'd thought was buried with his old life. The stallion's breathing had steadied somewhat, but his eyes never left Ben's face. There was an intelligence there that went beyond simple animal awareness. This creature was evaluating him, weighing his intentions against some internal scale that had kept him alive in the wild for nearly a decade. "You know what I think?" Ben said, his voice growing stronger as the conversation continued. "I think you came here for a reason. Martha would have said there's no such thing as coincidence when it comes to horses." He reached into the kit and pulled out a small bottle of antiseptic, holding it where the stallion could see it. "This is going to sting, but it'll help. That cut needs cleaning before infection sets in." The next hour was a delicate dance of advance and retreat. Ben would move closer by inches, speaking constantly in the low, rhythmic tones that horses found soothing. When the stallion showed signs of stress, ears back, nostrils flaring, Ben would freeze, sometimes for several minutes, until the animal relaxed again, when he finally touched the stallion's neck. Both man and horse seemed to exhale together. The coat was surprisingly soft beneath the dust and sweat, warm with life and wild freedom. Ben's hands, which had been clumsy and uncertain around people for 3 years, remembered their purpose. Cleaning the wound required patience and frequent breaks. The stallion would tolerate only so much before his pain overcame his trust, and Ben would have to back away, whispering reassurances until the animal calmed. But gradually, the gash was cleaned and bandaged with professional competence that surprised them both. "There," Ben said, settling back on his heels as the stallion inspected his handiwork with obvious skepticism. "That should hold until morning. But you're going to need more help than I can give you out here." As if understanding, the stallion attempted to rise. His first try ended in failure, the injured leg unable to bear weight. But on his second attempt, with Ben providing gentle encouragement and a steady hand on his shoulder, the horse managed to struggle to his feet. Standing, the stallion was magnificent despite his injuries, probably 15 hands high, with the kind of powerful hindquarters that could carry him across miles of rough country. His head was noble, ears alert despite his exhaustion. This was what horses had looked like before humans began breeding the wildness out of them. Ben filled a bucket with fresh water from the trough and offered it. The stallion drank deeply, his muzzle soft against Ben's palm as he steadied the bucket. When he'd finished, the horse lifted his head and looked directly into Ben's eyes. In that moment, something passed between them. Not understanding exactly, but recognition. Two creatures who had been alone too long, finding solace in each other's presence. "You can stay as long as you need," Ben said, surprised by the catch in his own voice. "I haven't had company in a while." As the night deepened, Ben brought blankets from the house and made a bed for himself near the water trough. He couldn't leave the injured animal alone, not when infection or shock could claim him before morning. It had been 3 years since Ben had spent a night under the stars. But lying there with the stallion's quiet breathing nearby, he remembered why he'd once loved it. The mustang stood through most of the night, dozing upright as wild horses do, but never straying far from the water trough that had become his sanctuary. Occasionally, he would lower his head to drink or to investigate the man who had shown him such unexpected kindness. Ben dozed fitfully, waking often to check on his patient. During one of these wakeful periods, around 3 in the morning, he heard something that made his pulse quicken. In the distance, carried on the night wind, came the sound of hoofbeats. Not the regular rhythm of domestic horses, but something wilder. The drumming of unshod hooves moving across open ground. The stallion heard it too. His head came up sharply, ears pricked forward, and he nickered softly into the darkness. The sound that came back was like nothing Ben had ever heard. The voices of the wild calling to their lost leader. "Your family," Ben whispered, wonder creeping into his voice. "They're looking for you." The stallion nickered again, but didn't move away from the trough. He seemed to understand that his people would find him when the time was right. For now, he was content to rest under the protection of the man who had offered him water and healing without asking for anything in return. As dawn approached, Ben found himself watching the horizon with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. Something was about to happen, something that would change everything. He didn't know what form it would take, but the certainty settled in his bones, like weather he could feel coming. The wounded stallion beside him represented more than just an injured animal in need of care. He was a messenger from a world Ben had forgotten existed, a world where trust was earned through gentle actions, where healing happened one careful touch at a time, and where the bonds between living creatures could bridge any gap that grief had carved. When the sun finally crested the eastern mountains, painting the valley in gold and amber light, Ben Carver discovered he was no longer alone. Ben woke to a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself, a deep, rhythmic thundering that vibrated through the ground and into his bones. For a disoriented moment, still caught between sleep and waking, he thought it might be a storm rolling across the valley. Then his eyes opened fully and he saw them. They came over the ridge like a living flood, silhouetted against the morning sky. Dozens of horses moving in perfect coordination, their unshod hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth with the precision of a military march. But this wasn't chaos or panic. This was purpose incarnate, flowing across his pasture land with the inevitability of weather. Ben pushed himself up from his makeshift bed, muscles protesting after a night on the hard ground. Beside him, the injured stallion stood alert but calm, his head high and ears pricked forward. There was no fear in the animal's posture, only recognition. These were his people, and they had come for him. The herd crested the small hill that bordered Ben's property and flowed down into the main pasture like water finding its level. As they drew closer, Ben could make out individual animals in the dawn light. Mares with foals at their sides, young bachelors traveling in loose groups at the edges of the main herd. older horses with scars that told stories of survival in a world where weakness meant death. At the front of the group, a magnificent black mare led the procession. She was older than the injured stallion beside Ben, her muzzle grey with age, but her bearing unmistakably regal. This was the matriarch, the decision-maker who had brought them all here in search of their missing leader. The herd arranged itself with military precision around Ben's ranch. Not randomly, not in the scattered pattern of grazing animals, but in a deliberate circle that encompassed his house, barn, and the water trough where their stallion stood watching. They faced inward, toward the center of their formation, as if standing guard. "Sweet Lord," Ben whispered, his voice barely audible above the settling sounds of 40-some horses finding their positions. In 30 years of working with domestic animals, he'd never witnessed anything like this. It was coordination that spoke of intelligence beyond simple herd instinct, communication that transcended anything he'd learned in veterinary textbooks. The black mare stepped forward from the circle, moving with deliberate grace toward the water trough. She stopped just outside what Ben instinctively recognized as a respectful distance and nickered softly to the injured stallion. His response was immediate, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to carry information Ben couldn't interpret but clearly understood. For several minutes, the two horses engaged in what could only be called conversation. Head positions, ear movements, subtle shifts in posture that conveyed meaning across the space between them. Ben found himself holding his breath, afraid that any movement might break the spell of what he was witnessing. Finally, the mare turned her attention to him. Her dark eyes were ancient and knowing, holding a depth of intelligence that made Ben feel suddenly small. She studied him with the thoroughness of someone conducting an interview, evaluating not just his appearance, but something deeper, his intentions perhaps, or his worthiness to care for one of their own. Ben remained perfectly still, instinctively understanding that this was a moment of judgment. The mare was deciding whether he could be trusted, whether the injured stallion was safe in his care, whether the herd would accept his presence in their drama. The weight of that evaluation settled on his shoulders like a physical thing. After what felt like an eternity, the mare dipped her head once, a gesture so deliberate and human-like that Ben felt his heart skip. Then she turned and walked back to her position in the circle, and the entire herd seemed to exhale in unison. They were staying. "What are you folks doing?" Ben asked aloud, his voice shaky with wonder and a touch of panic. This was beyond his experience, beyond anything he'd ever heard of. Wild horses didn't behave this way. They didn't organize themselves around human dwellings like some kind of vigil. But even as his rational mind struggled to categorize what he was seeing, another part of him, the part that had spent decades learning to read animal behavior, recognized the truth. They were protecting their leader. More than that, they were honoring the human who had chosen to help him. The injured stallion beside him had been watching the proceedings with obvious satisfaction. Now he turned to Ben and did something that raised goosebumps along his arms. The horse bowed his head, lowering it until his muzzle nearly touched the ground, and held the position for several seconds. "You're thanking me," Ben said, wonder creeping into his voice. "And they're saying thank you too." As if in response to his words, several of the horses in the circle nickered softly. Not the sharp calls of alarm or greeting, but something gentler. Something that sounded remarkably like approval. Ben looked around the circle of horses surrounding his property and felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in 3 years. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was the absence of the crushing loneliness that had become his constant companion. For the first time since Martha's death, he wasn't alone. The sun climbed higher, and the horses settled into a routine that suggested they planned to stay. The mares with foals found shaded spots where the little ones could rest. The bachelor groups positioned themselves strategically around the perimeter, clearly serving as sentries. The older animals, their coats bearing the silver of advanced years, found comfortable spots where they could keep watch while conserving energy. It was a society in miniature, Ben realized. A community with rules and hierarchies and responsibilities that he was only beginning to glimpse. And somehow, through his simple act of kindness to their leader, he'd been granted observer status in their world. The implications began to settle on him like morning dew. These animals had homes, territories they'd claimed in the wild country beyond his valley. They had routines, migrations, seasonal patterns that governed their lives. Yet they'd abandoned all of that to come here, to surround his ranch in what could only be described as an act of gratitude. "Martha," he whispered, looking up at the sky where wisps of clouds drifted across an endless blue expanse. "If you're watching this, I hope you're getting a kick out of it. You always said horses were smarter than most people gave them credit for." As if summoned by her name, a memory surfaced. Martha standing in this same spot 7 years ago, watching a small herd of elk graze in their upper pasture. "Animals know things we've forgotten," she'd said, her hand warm in his as they stood together in the early morning light. "They recognize kindness. They remember it. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, they return it." Looking around at the circle of wild horses that had chosen to honor his ranch with their presence, Ben felt the first crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. It wasn't much, just a hairline fracture that let in the smallest sliver of light. But it was a beginning. The injured stallion moved closer to him, favoring his wounded leg, but determined to close the distance between them. When he was near enough, the horse extended his muzzle and breathed softly against Ben's neck, a gesture of trust and affection that nearly brought tears to the old rancher's eyes. "All right." "A friend," Ben said, his voice thick with emotion. "I guess we're in this together now, whatever this is." Around them, the wild herd maintained their vigil, and Ben Carver began to understand that his life had just taken a turn he never could have anticipated. The question now was whether he had the courage to follow where it led. By noon, the reality of Ben's situation had begun to set in with a weight that pressed against his chest like altitude sickness. 43 wild horses had effectively claimed his ranch as their temporary home, and he had no idea what that meant legally, practically, or financially. The injured stallion, Ben had started thinking of him as Thunder, though he couldn't say why, showed improvement with each hour. The bandage on his leg remained clean and dry, and he was putting more weight on the limb as the pain medication did its work. But the rest of the herd showed no signs of leaving. If anything, they seemed to be settling in for an extended stay. Ben stood in his kitchen, looking out the window at what had once been his quiet, empty ranch. Now it looked like something out of a nature documentary. Horses grazed peacefully across his pastures, their movements creating an ever-shifting pattern against the golden grass. Foals played under the watchful eyes of their mothers. The black mare, whom Ben had mentally dubbed Majesty, held court near his barn like a queen receiving visitors from various members of her extended family. The sound of an engine made Ben's stomach clench. A white pickup truck was making its way up his drive, leaving a plume of dust in its wake. Through the windshield, he could see the familiar face of Tom Wilson, his closest neighbor and one of the few people who'd attempted to maintain contact after Martha's death. Ben considered not answering the door, but Tom had already spotted him through the window and was waving with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he'd come with news to share. "Ben!" Tom called as he climbed out of his truck, his eyes wide with amazement as he took in the horses scattered across the property. "Holy hell, what's going on here? Did you buy yourself a circus?" "Morning, Tom," Ben said, stepping onto the porch but staying near the door, close enough to retreat if necessary. "Didn't buy anything. They just showed up." Tom whistled low, turning in a slow circle to take in the full scope of the situation. "Just showed up? Ben, there must be 50 horses here. You can't just have 50 horses show up on your doorstep like some kind of—" He stopped mid-sentence, his gaze landing on Thunder, standing near the water trough. "Is that one hurt?" "Found him last night," Ben said. "Cut on his leg. Tended to it, and come morning, his family arrived to check on him." The simplicity of the explanation seemed to deflate Tom's initial excitement. He scratched his head, looking from Ben to the horses and back again. "Family. Ben, these are wild animals. They don't have family reunions on people's ranches. Maybe they do, and we just never noticed, Ben replied, surprising himself with the defensive edge in his voice. Tom studied his neighbor's face with the concern of someone who'd known him for 20 years. You doing okay, Ben? I mean, really okay? Because this is, well, it's pretty unusual. Before Ben could respond, another vehicle appeared on the horizon. This one was moving faster, its urgency apparent even from a distance. As it drew closer, Ben could see it was Sheriff Dale Morrison's patrol car. Its light bar flashing, but no siren. Somebody called the law. Tom observed unnecessarily. Sheriff Morrison pulled up behind Tom's truck and climbed out with the measured movements of a man who'd seen enough strange situations to approach each new one with caution. Dale was younger than Ben by about 15 years, but he'd been sheriff long enough to handle most of what the valley could throw at him. This, however, was clearly outside his normal experience. "Afternoon, Ben," Dale said, tipping his hat. "Got a call from the Hendersons about some kind of disturbance out here. Something about wild horses." His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone trying not to jump to conclusions. "No disturbance, Dale," Ben replied. "They're just visiting." The sheriff looked around the property with professional thoroughness, taking in the orderly arrangement of the horses and their calm demeanor. "Visiting," he repeated slowly. "Ben, I'm going to need you to walk me through what's happening here. For the next 15 minutes, Ben found himself explaining the previous night's events to an audience that grew as words spread through the valley's informal communication network. The Hendersons arrived in their beat-up Ford, followed by Maria Santos from the feed store and her teenage son Carlos. Each newcomer brought the same expression of amazement and concern, the same questions about how such a thing was possible. Ben noticed that the horses were reacting to the human audience with interest, but no fear. Several of the younger animals had actually moved closer to the fence line, as if curious about the gathering crowd. Majesty, the black mare, had positioned herself where she could observe everything while remaining close to Thunder. "The thing is," Sheriff Morrison said after hearing the full story, "legally speaking, these are protected animals. Wild horses fall under federal jurisdiction. I'm going to have to make some calls." The words hit Ben like cold water. Federal jurisdiction meant bureaucracy, regulations, people with clipboards who would want to catalog and control something that felt sacred. "They're not hurting anything, Dale. They're just being horses." "I understand that, Ben, and I'm not looking to cause trouble for anybody. But we've got responsibilities here. Public safety, property rights, wildlife management. There are procedures." Dr. Helen Rodriguez's veterinary truck appeared on the ridge, and Ben felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Helen would understand the medical situation with Thunder, but she'd also bring her own set of professional concerns. "Word travels fast," Tom observed, watching Helen navigate her truck carefully around the gathered vehicles. Helen climbed out and immediately began scanning the herd with professional interest. Her gaze lingered on Thunder, taking in his bandaged leg and the way he favored it. "Ben," she called out, "that stallion needs proper medical attention." "He's getting it," Ben replied, though he knew she was right. His basic first aid was sufficient for emergency treatment, but Thunder's injury required veterinary expertise. "May I examine him?" Helen asked, already pulling supplies from her truck. The next hour became a strange blend of medical procedure and community gathering. Helen worked on Thunder with Ben's assistance, while the crowd of neighbors watched from a respectful distance. The stallion accepted her treatment with remarkable calm, as if he understood that she, like Ben, was there to help. "This is incredible," Helen murmured, as she cleaned and rebandaged the wound. "His healing response is exceptional. And his condition, Ben, this animal is in magnificent health aside from the injury. You can see the muscle tone, the coat condition. This herd is thriving." Sheriff Morrison had been making phone calls, and his expression grew more troubled with each conversation. "Ben," he said, approaching as Helen finished her work, "I've got to be honest with you. The State Wildlife Department wants to send someone out. So does the Bureau of Land Management. This situation, it's unprecedented." Ben felt the walls closing in. The same sensation he'd experienced in the months after Martha's funeral, when well-meaning friends and relatives had surrounded him with advice and expectations. "What does that mean?" "It means you're about to become very popular," Dale said grimly. "And these horses, they're about to become a matter of public interest." As if sensing the change in mood, Thunder moved closer to Ben and rested his muzzle against the man's shoulder. The gesture was gentle but possessive, a clear statement about where the stallion's loyalty lay, looking around at the gathered faces, some curious, some concerned, some already calculating the angles this story might provide. Ben realized that his quiet life of grief and solitude had just become very complicated. The question was whether he had the strength to protect what had been given to him, or if the weight of public attention would drive away the most meaningful thing that had happened to him since Martha's death. The government officials arrived 3 days later, like a small invasion force. 2 white SUVs and a pickup truck, all bearing official seals and occupied by people carrying clipboards, cameras, and expressions of professional concern. Ben watched them from his kitchen window, his morning coffee growing cold in his hands as he steeled himself for what was coming. Thunder had recovered enough to move around the property with only a slight limp, though he never strayed far from the water trough that had become his sanctuary. The rest of the herd maintained their vigil, having settled into routines that suggested they planned to stay indefinitely. Ben had grown accustomed to waking to the soft sounds of horses moving through his pastures, their presence both comforting and increasingly complicated. The lead official introduced herself as Dr. Susan Chen from the Bureau of Land Management, a woman in her 40s with the efficient manner of someone who'd spent years navigating bureaucratic waters. Behind her came representatives from the State Wildlife Department, the Department of Agriculture, and what appeared to be a journalist with a very expensive camera. "Mr. Carver," Dr. Chen said, extending a hand that Ben shook reluctantly, "we appreciate your cooperation in this matter. What we have here is quite unusual, unprecedented. Really. And we need to assess the situation for the safety of both the animals and the community." Ben nodded, knowing that resistance at this stage would only make things worse. "They're not causing any harm." "I understand your perspective," Dr. Chen replied diplomatically, "but we have protocols to follow. Wild horse populations are carefully managed, and when they establish new territories or behaviors, we need to evaluate the implications." The next several hours felt like an interrogation disguised as a conversation. Officials measured his property, photographed the horses from multiple angles, and asked detailed questions about every aspect of the past 3 days. They wanted to know about Thunder's injury, the herd's behavior patterns, even Ben's own background and qualifications to handle the situation. Through it all, the horses remained remarkably calm. Several of the younger animals seemed genuinely curious about the visitors, approaching the fence line to investigate the strange new humans. Majesty, the black mare, maintained her position near Thunder, but showed no signs of agitation or protective aggression. "Their behavior is extraordinary," admitted Dr. Sarah Wayne from the Wildlife Department, watching a group of foals play near the barn. "I've studied wild horse populations for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this level of organization and purposefulness." "They're protecting him," Ben said, nodding toward Thunder. "That's all." "It's more than that," Dr. Wayne insisted. "Look at how they've arranged themselves. This isn't random grazing or temporary shelter seeking. This is a deliberate choice to establish a presence here. The question is why." Ben could have told them why, but he doubted they'd understand. The horses had recognized something in him that he was only beginning to rediscover himself, a capacity for healing that extended beyond bandaging wounds. They saw the man he'd been before grief hollowed him out, and they were betting on his ability to find that person again. Dr. Helen Rodriguez arrived in the afternoon, having been contacted by the officials for her professional assessment. Her presence brought Ben a measure of relief. At least one person in the growing crowd understood the situation from a perspective that wasn't purely regulatory. The stallion's injury is healing exceptionally well, Helen reported after a thorough examination. Mr. Carver's initial treatment was exactly appropriate, and the animal shows no signs of stress or malnourishment. In fact, the entire herd appears to be in excellent condition. That supports our preliminary assessment, Dr. Chen said, making notes on her tablet. These animals aren't in distress. They're here by choice. The journalist, a young woman named Rebecca Martinez from the regional newspaper, had been quietly documenting everything with professional detachment. Now she approached Ben with the careful manner of someone trying to extract a story without appearing invasive. "Mr. Carver," she said, "can you tell me what it's been like living with this herd on your property? How has it changed your daily routine?" Ben looked out at the horses scattered across his pastures, some grazing peacefully, others resting in the shade of the cottonwoods. 3 days ago, this land had been empty except for memories. Now it was alive with purpose and presence in a way he hadn't experienced since Martha's death. "It's like the ranch remembered how to breathe," he said finally. Surprised by his own honesty, Rebecca's pen stilled above her notebook. "Can you explain that?" "My wife and we raised horses here for 30 years. After she passed, I sold them all. The place felt dead without her. But these horses, they brought something back. Not the same thing, but something." He paused, struggling to articulate feelings he was still discovering. "They reminded me that the land doesn't stop being alive just because the people do." The officials exchanged glances that Ben couldn't interpret. Dr. Chen cleared her throat diplomatically. "Mr. Carver, while we appreciate the spiritual aspect of this situation, we have practical concerns. Wild horse populations must be managed to prevent overgrazing, disease transmission, and conflicts with human activities. This herd can't simply remain here indefinitely. Why not?" The question came out more sharply than Ben intended. "They're not damaging anything. They're not interfering with anyone else's property. And they're clearly not interested in leaving, because it sets a precedent," Dr. Wayne explained. "If wild horses can establish permanent residence on private property without oversight, it undermines the entire management system we've developed to protect them." Ben felt anger rising in his chest, the first strong emotion he'd experienced in years that wasn't rooted in grief. "Protect them from what? Living free? Making their own choices about where they belong?" "From starvation during harsh winters," Dr. Chen said patiently. "From overpopulation that leads to resource depletion. From conflicts with humans that result in injury or death. These animals need management, Mr. Carver, even if they don't always appreciate it." Thunder, as if sensing the tension in the conversation, moved closer to the group of humans. He walked directly to Ben and pressed his muzzle against the man's chest, a gesture of trust and affection that brought sudden quiet to the discussion. "He's bonded with you," Dr. Wayne observed with professional interest. "That's remarkable for a wild animal. It suggests a level of intelligence and emotional capacity that we're only beginning to understand. Martha always said horses were smarter than most people," Ben said, his hand moving automatically to stroke Thunder's neck. "Maybe we're the ones who need managing." The comment drew a small smile from Rebecca, but the officials maintained their serious expressions. They had procedures to follow, forms to complete, decisions to make about the future of the herd that had chosen Ben's ranch as their temporary kingdom. As evening approached and the visitors prepared to leave, Dr. Chen pulled Ben aside for a private conversation. "Mr. Carver, I want you to understand that we're not the enemy here. We genuinely want what's best for these animals. But we need time to assess the situation properly, and we need your cooperation." "What does that mean, practically?" "It means no attempts to relocate them yourself, no interference with our monitoring activities, and no encouragement of additional horses to join the group." She paused. "It also means that if we determine they need to be relocated to a managed sanctuary, you'll need to accept that decision." Ben looked across his property at the horses who had brought his land back to life, at Thunder, who had taught him that healing was possible, at Majesty, who had shown him what leadership without dominance looked like. The thought of losing them felt like preparation for another funeral. "How long do I have?" he asked. "We'll complete our assessment within 2 weeks," Dr. Chen said. "After that, we'll make recommendations to the appropriate authorities. 2 weeks to discover if the miracle that had arrived at his water trough would be allowed to remain, or if bureaucratic necessity would scatter the herd back to wherever wild things go when humans decide they don't belong." The story broke in the regional newspaper 2 days later with a headline that made Ben wince. "Wild horses stage unprecedented vigil at Montana Ranch." Rebecca Martinez had written a piece that was both factually accurate and emotionally compelling. But Ben hadn't anticipated how quickly the attention would escalate. By the second day after publication, his phone, which had sat silent for months at a time over the past 3 years, rang constantly. Local television stations wanted interviews. Wildlife photographers requested permission to document the herd. A children's book author called asking about movie rights. The quiet isolation Ben had cultivated so carefully was crumbling under the weight of public fascination. "You're famous." "Neighbor," Tom Wilson said, finding Ben in the barn where he'd retreated from the chaos.
"Saw you on the morning news in Helena."
They're calling it a remarkable display of animal intelligence and gratitude. Ben continued filling water buckets, a task that had become both practical necessity and therapeutic ritual. "Never asked to be famous. Maybe not," Tom said, settling onto a hay bale with the easy familiarity of long friendship. "But maybe that's not the point anymore." Before Ben could ask what he meant, the sound of multiple vehicles approaching made them both look toward the drive. This time it wasn't officials or journalists. It was a small convoy of pickup trucks and SUVs carrying families with children, cameras, and expressions of wonder. "They're here to see the horses," Tom observed unnecessarily. Ben felt his chest tighten with the old anxiety that had kept him isolated since Martha's death. Dealing with government officials was one thing. They had procedures to follow and jobs to do. But this was different. These were people seeking something from him, and he wasn't sure he had anything to give. Thunder appeared at the barn entrance, as if summoned, his injury now barely noticeable as he moved with fluid grace. Over the past week, the stallion had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense Ben's emotional state, offering his calm presence whenever the human seemed overwhelmed. "Easy. A friend," Ben murmured, his hand finding the familiar warmth of Thunder's neck. "Just more curious, folks." A woman in her 30s approached the barn, her 8-year-old daughter hanging back shyly behind her. "Mr. Carver, I'm Linda Patterson. We drove up from Billings after reading about your horses. My daughter Emma has been fascinated by horses since she was tiny. And when we saw the story," she gestured helplessly toward the herd visible through the barn doors. Emma stepped forward, her eyes wide with the kind of wonder that only children could truly achieve. "Are they really wild?" she asked in a whisper. "Did they really come here just to say thank you?" Ben looked down at the little girl and felt something shift inside his chest. Her question was innocent, direct, and completely sincere, the kind of question that adults learned not to ask because the answers might require them to believe in something larger than themselves. "They came here for their friend," Ben said, nodding toward Thunder. "Sometimes that's what families do." Emma's face lit up with understanding and delight. "Can I see him up close?" What happened next surprised everyone, including Ben. Thunder, who had shown remarkable tolerance for the various officials and photographers, took several steps toward the little girl with obvious intent. He lowered his great head until his muzzle was level with Emma's face and breathed softly. Against her cheek, Emma giggled, a sound like water over stones, and reached out to touch Thunder's face with the fearless gentleness that marked her as someone born to understand animals. "He's so soft," she whispered. "Emma's been asking for riding lessons for 2 years, Linda Patterson said, tears gathering in her eyes. "But we live in the city and it's expensive." "And I wasn't sure," she trailed off, watching her daughter commune with a wild stallion as if they were old friends. More families had gathered, drawn by the sight of a child interacting safely with an animal that should have been dangerous. Ben found himself surrounded by parents and children, all asking questions, all seeking some kind of connection to the miracle unfolding on his ranch. "How do you do it?" asked a teenage boy whose mother had driven him 3 hours for this visit. "How do you get wild animals to trust you?" Ben looked around at the expectant faces and realized he was being asked to be something he'd never been: a teacher, a guide, someone who could explain the inexplicable. The thought terrified him, but Thunder's steady presence at his shoulder gave him courage to try. "You don't get them to trust you," he said slowly. "You earn it. One breath at a time, one moment at a time. You show them that you're not there to take anything from them, just to offer what you can." "Like water?" Emma asked, still stroking Thunder's neck. "Like water," Ben agreed. "Like kindness. Like patience when they're afraid." An older man with calloused hands and intelligent eyes stepped forward. "I'm David Clearwater," he said, extending his hand. "I work with the Northern Plains Wildlife Sanctuary. We've been following this story with great interest." Ben shook the offered hand cautiously. "Another government agency?" David smiled. "No, we're a private organization. We provide educational programs about wildlife conservation, habitat protection, that sort of thing. What you've got here, this relationship between wild animals and a human caregiver, it's exactly the kind of story that could change how people think about conservation." "I'm not trying to change anything," Ben said. "I just helped an injured horse. And that simple act of compassion has created something extraordinary," David continued. "Do you realize what you could teach people? Families like these, children like Emma, they're hungry for real connection with the natural world. You could show them what that looks like." The idea sat uneasily on Ben's shoulders. He'd spent 3 years avoiding human connection, and now someone was suggesting he invite it in wholesale. "I wouldn't know how to teach anyone anything." "You wouldn't have to lecture," David assured him. "Just let people observe. Let them see how you interact with the horses, how the horses respond to gentle treatment. Experience is the best teacher." Dr. Helen Rodriguez arrived as the conversation continued, her veterinary truck navigating carefully around the growing crowd of visitors. She climbed out with professional efficiency, but paused when she saw the scene unfolding near the barn. "Helen!" Ben called out, grateful for her familiar presence. "Thought you should check on Thunder's progress." "I can see his progress from here," Helen said, watching the stallion accept gentle touches from a half-dozen children who had gathered around him like he was a large, patient dog. "Ben, what you've accomplished here, it's remarkable." "I didn't accomplish anything. I just didn't interfere. Sometimes that's the greatest accomplishment of all," Helen said softly. She moved closer, lowering her voice so the families couldn't overhear. "Ben, I've been thinking about something. These people, these families, they're not just here to see the horses. They're here because this place, this story, represents something they're missing in their own lives." Ben looked around at the visitors scattered across his property. Parents watching their children interact with wild animals, elderly couples holding hands as they observed the herd grazing peacefully in the afternoon light. Teenagers putting away their phones to focus on something real and immediate and beautiful. What are they missing? "Connection," Helen said simply. "Real connection. To the natural world, to each other, to something larger than their daily routine. You've created a place where that's possible." Thunder nickered softly, drawing Ben's attention back to the present moment. The stallion was looking at him with those ancient, intelligent eyes, and in their depths Ben saw something that took his breath away. Not dependence or gratitude, but partnership. An invitation to become something more than he'd been. "Martha would have loved this," Ben said quietly, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "Yes," Helen agreed. "She would have. And she would have told you to trust it." As the afternoon wore on and the visitors gradually departed, each family thanking Ben for an experience they'd clearly never forget, he found himself standing in the center of his property, surrounded by wild horses and feeling something he hadn't experienced since his wife's funeral. He felt needed. The call came at 6:30 in the morning, jarring Ben from the deepest sleep he'd experienced in years. Dr. Chen's voice carried an urgency that immediately banished any lingering drowsiness. Mr. Carver, we need you to meet us at your property immediately. Don't approach the herd until we arrive. This is extremely important. Ben dressed quickly, his mind racing through possibilities. Had something happened to one of the horses? Was Thunder's injury worse than they'd thought? He stepped onto his porch to find the herd arranged in their usual formation, but there was something different about their behavior. They stood more alert than usual, heads raised and ears pricked forward, all facing the same direction. 3 government vehicles arrived within minutes of each other, followed by Dr. Rodriguez's familiar truck. The officials moved with the kind of coordinated efficiency that suggested they'd been planning this visit carefully. Dr. Chen approached Ben with an expression he couldn't read. "Mr. Carver, we've made a discovery that changes everything about this situation." "What kind of discovery?" "Yesterday, we received genetic analysis results from hair samples we collected during our initial assessment," Dr. Wayne explained, joining the conversation. "What we found is, well, it's unprecedented." Ben felt his stomach clench. "Are they sick? Is there some kind of disease?" "No, nothing like that," Dr. Chen assured him quickly. "Mr. Carver, these horses aren't just any wild herd. They're descendants of a bloodline we thought had been lost forever." The words didn't immediately make sense to Ben. "Lost?" Dr. Wayne pulled out a tablet and scrolled to a document filled with scientific terminology and genetic diagrams. In the 1870s, there was a legendary stallion known as Windwalker. He was said to be the greatest of the wild horses, possessing intelligence and physical abilities that bordered on the mythical. Windwalker founded a bloodline that produced some of the most remarkable horses ever documented in the American West. "I don't understand what this has to do with—" "Windwalker's bloodline was presumed extinct," Dr. Chen interrupted. "The last confirmed descendant died in captivity in 1923, but these horses, your Thunder in particular, carry genetic markers that prove they're direct descendants of that legendary bloodline." Ben looked out at Thunder, who was watching the proceedings with his usual calm intelligence. "You're saying he's special?" "Mr. Carver," Dr. Wayne said solemnly, "Thunder isn't just special. He's irreplaceable. He and this herd represent the resurrection of a bloodline that wildlife geneticists have dreamed of rediscovering for nearly a century." The implications began to cascade through Ben's mind like dominoes falling. "What does that mean for them?" Dr. Chen and Dr. Wayne exchanged glances that made Ben's chest tighten with apprehension. "It means they can't stay here," Dr. Chen said gently. "This herd needs to be relocated to a protected breeding facility immediately. Their genetic material is too valuable to risk in an uncontrolled environment." "Breeding facility?" Ben felt anger rising in his chest. "You mean prison?" "We mean safety," Dr. Wayne corrected. "Mr. Carver, do you understand what we're telling you? This bloodline could revolutionize our understanding of wild horse genetics. These animals could be the key to strengthening wild populations across the entire western United States, and all it costs is their freedom." Dr. Chen's voice took on the patient tone of someone explaining an unpleasant necessity to a child. "Freedom without genetic diversity leads to extinction. Mr. Carver, these horses have a responsibility to their species that transcends individual liberty." Dr. Rodriguez, who had been quietly listening to the exchange, stepped forward with obvious concern. "How soon are we talking about relocation?" "The transport vehicles will arrive tomorrow morning," Dr. Wayne replied. "We've already made arrangements with the National Wild Horse Research Center in Nevada. They have facilities specifically designed for genetic preservation programs. Tomorrow." The word hit Ben like a physical blow. After everything that had happened, the healing, the trust, the sense of purpose he'd rediscovered, they wanted to tear it all away in less than 24 hours. "No," Ben said quietly. The officials looked at him with surprise. "I'm sorry?" Dr. Chen said. "No," Ben repeated, his voice growing stronger. "You can't take them. Mr. Carver, I understand your attachment, but this isn't a matter of personal preference. This is a federal wildlife management decision based on scientific necessity." Ben walked toward Thunder, who immediately moved to meet him. The stallion's muzzle found his shoulder in the gesture of affection that had become as natural as breathing between them. "This horse chose to trust me," Ben said, his hand stroking Thunder's neck. "His whole family chose to trust me. I won't betray that trust by letting you cage them." "It's not caging," Dr. Wayne protested. "It's conservation. Call it whatever makes you sleep better at night," Ben replied. "But I know what I'm seeing. These animals came here because they needed help, and they stayed because they found something worth staying for. You want to take that away and call it science." Dr. Chen's professional patience was beginning to show cracks. "Mr. Carver, you don't seem to understand. This isn't a request. Under federal wildlife protection statutes, we have the authority to relocate these animals with or without your consent. Then you'll have to do it without my cooperation." The standoff that followed was broken by an unexpected voice. David Clearwater from the Northern Plains Wildlife Sanctuary approached the group, having arrived without Ben noticing. "Excuse me," David said, his tone respectful but firm. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. May I suggest an alternative?" Dr. Chen turned to him with barely concealed irritation. "This is a federal matter, Mr. Clearwater. Private organizations don't have jurisdiction here." "No, but we do have resources," David replied calmly. "And we have a proposition that might serve everyone's interests." He produced a folder, thick with documents, and spread several papers on the tailgate of Ben's truck. "What if these horses could contribute to genetic conservation efforts without being removed from their chosen habitat?" Dr. Wayne leaned forward with obvious skepticism. "That's not possible. Genetic preservation requires controlled breeding environments." "Not necessarily," David said. "Our organization has been developing a new model for in situ conservation, protecting and studying endangered bloodlines in their natural or chosen environments rather than in captivity. We've had remarkable success with other species." He pointed to photographs and charts in his documentation. "We can establish this ranch as a protected study site. Mr. Carver would retain ownership and daily management, but trained researchers would monitor the herd's health, breeding patterns and genetic contributions. Any foals would remain with the herd, but would also contribute genetic material to the National Preservation Program." "That's highly irregular," Dr. Chen said, but her tone suggested she was considering the possibility. "It's innovative," David corrected, "and it addresses both concerns, genetic conservation and animal welfare. These horses have demonstrated extraordinary intelligence and social organization. Studying them in their chosen environment could provide insights that laboratory conditions never could." Ben felt a spark of hope kindle in his chest. "They could stay." "They could stay," David confirmed. "But it would mean accepting responsibility for their care, their protection, and their contribution to conservation efforts. It would mean opening your ranch to researchers, educators, and carefully managed public access. It would mean becoming a partner in their preservation rather than just their caretaker." Thunder moved closer to Ben, as if sensing the importance of the moment. Around the property, the rest of the herd maintained their watchful positions, their presence a reminder of what hung in the balance. "Mr. Carver," Dr. Chen said carefully, "if you're seriously considering this alternative, you need to understand the implications. This wouldn't be a temporary arrangement. You'd be committing to a long-term partnership with multiple organizations. Your privacy, your independence, they'd be permanently altered." Ben looked around at the horses that had brought his ranch back to life, at Thunder, who had taught him that healing was possible, at the vast Montana landscape that Martha had loved. Then he thought about the children who had visited, the wonder in their eyes as they connected with something wild and beautiful. "My wife always said the land doesn't belong to us," he said finally. "We belong to it. Maybe it's time I started acting like it." The paperwork spread across Ben's kitchen table looked like the blueprint for dismantling his life as he'd known it. Legal documents, conservation agreements, educational program contracts, and liability waivers, each page representing another layer of commitment to a future he couldn't quite imagine. David Clearwater sat across from him, Patient as granite as Ben worked through the implications of what he was considering. Outside, the sun was setting over the Bitterroot Valley, painting the horses in golden light as they grazed peacefully across his property. Thunder stood near the water trough, his injury now just a memory. His presence as constant as Ben's own shadow. "Take me through it one more time," Ben said, rubbing his temples where a headache had been building all afternoon. David leaned forward, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone who understood that details mattered. The ranch would be designated as a private conservation sanctuary under federal protection. You'd retain ownership and primary management authority, but the property would be subject to conservation easements that prevent development or sale to non-conservation entities. Meaning, I could never sell to someone who might turn it into condos. Correct. The land would be protected in perpetuity. In exchange, the federal government provides tax benefits, and our organization provides funding for infrastructure improvements, veterinary care, and educational programs. Ben picked up the next document. "This part about public access, carefully managed," David assured him. "No more than 20 visitors per day, and only with advance reservations and guided supervision. The goal is education, not tourism. We want people to understand what they're seeing, not just gawk at it." The phone rang, and Ben glanced at the caller ID with resignation. Ever since the story about Thunder's bloodline had broken, the calls had been constant. This time it was Sheriff Morrison. "Ben, I've got some news you need to hear," Dale said without preamble. "There's been a development with the federal people." "What kind of development?" "The kind where they're losing patience with negotiations. Word is, if you don't sign their relocation order by tomorrow morning, they're prepared to move forward with mandatory seizure." Ben felt his stomach drop. "They can do that?" "Under the Endangered Species Act, if an animal population is deemed critical to species survival, federal authorities have broad powers." "I'm sorry, Ben. I tried to buy you more time, but their superiors in Washington are applying pressure." After Dale hung up, the kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock Martha had bought at an antique store in Missoula. Each second felt weighted with decision, with the approaching moment when he'd have to choose between safety and principle. "They're not bluffing," David said quietly. "I've seen this before with other endangered populations. Once bureaucratic momentum builds, it's almost impossible to stop. How long do we have?" "If you sign the sanctuary agreement tonight, I can have it filed with the appropriate agencies before their deadline." "But Ben," David's voice grew serious, "you need to understand what you're signing up for. This isn't just about keeping the horses. This is about transforming your life into something completely different." Ben walked to the window and looked out at the herd. Majesty, the black mare, had positioned herself where she could observe both the house and the surrounding territory. Several foals played near their mothers, their energy infectious even in the gathering dusk. Thunder raised his head and looked directly at Ben, as if sensing the weight of the decision being made on his behalf. "Tell me about the educational programs," Ben said finally. David joined him at the window. "School groups primarily. Children from urban areas who've never seen wild animals up close. We'd bring them here to observe the horses, to learn about conservation, about the relationship between humans and wildlife. You'd be part of that teaching, showing them what respect for wild animals looks like in practice." The idea still terrified Ben, but less than it had a week ago. The children who had visited, like young Emma Patterson, had reminded him of something he'd forgotten, that wonder was contagious, and that sharing it could be as healing as experiencing it. "What about researchers?" "Graduate students primarily. Maybe 1 or 2 at a time, staying in temporary housing we'd build near the barn. They'd study the herd's social structure, their adaptation to semi-domesticated life, their breeding patterns. The data would contribute to wild horse management policies across the country." Ben considered this. Strangers living on his property, observing his daily interactions with the horses, documenting every aspect of the life he'd built with them. The prospect made his chest tight with anxiety. "I've been alone for 3 years, he said quietly. "I'm not sure I remember how to live around people." "You've been practicing," David observed. Every visitor who's come here in the past week has left feeling like they've experienced something transformative. You've been teaching without realizing it. Dr. Rodriguez arrived as full darkness settled over the valley. She carried coffee and sandwiches, having anticipated a long night of decision-making. "Any word from the federal folks?" she asked, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. "Tomorrow morning deadline," Ben replied. "Sign or watch them take the horses." Helen nodded grimly. "I've been making calls to colleagues around the country. Ben, if Thunder and his herd go to that research facility in Nevada, they'll spend the rest of their lives in paddocks. Valuable paddocks with excellent medical care, but paddocks nonetheless. And if I sign this sanctuary agreement, they live free on the land they chose, but that freedom comes with obligations," David said. "To conservation, to education, to the future of their species." Ben picked up the main contract and read through it again. The language was dense with legal terminology, but the core commitment was clear. He would be trading his solitude for partnership, his independence for responsibility to something larger than himself. "There's something else you should know," Helen said carefully. "I've been talking to other veterinarians about Thunder's recovery. Ben, what you accomplished with basic first aid and gentle care, it's medically remarkable. That horse should have needed surgery, should have had complications. Instead, he healed better than most animals do under clinical conditions. What are you saying?" "I'm saying you have a gift for this work, a natural ability to heal animals through compassion as much as medicine. The research community is fascinated by the bond you've formed with a wild stallion, but I think it goes deeper than that. I think you understand something about healing that most of us are still learning." Ben thought about the night he'd found Thunder collapsed by the water trough, about the gentle process of earning trust, about the patient work of allowing healing to happen rather than forcing it. It was the same approach he'd used with all the horses he and Martha had trained over the years, partnership instead of dominance. "Martha always said I was better with horses than people," he said. "Maybe the horses are teaching you how to be better with people too," Helen suggested. The kitchen clock struck 9. Outside, he could see the silhouettes of the horses settling into their nighttime routine. Some would sleep lying down, others would doze standing up, but all would remain alert to potential threats. They trusted him to keep watch from the house, just as he trusted them to alert him to anything unusual. "If I do this," Ben said slowly, "if I sign this agreement, what happens to my grief?" The question surprised both David and Helen. They looked at him with expressions that suggested they understood he was asking something deeper than the words implied. "What do you mean?" Helen asked gently. "For 3 years, grief has been my companion. It's been terrible, but it's also been mine. It's been my connection to Martha, my way of honoring what we had together. If I move forward with this, if I build something new, am I betraying her memory?" David was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of personal experience. "I lost my wife 8 years ago to cancer. For the first few years, I thought moving forward meant leaving her behind. But I was wrong. Moving forward means carrying the best of what she gave you into whatever comes next." "Martha loved horses," Ben said, his voice thick with emotion. "She loved this land. She loved teaching children about the natural world. If she were here, she'd tell you to sign the papers," Helen finished gently. "She'd tell you that love isn't preserved in isolation, it's multiplied by sharing it." Ben walked to the counter where Martha's wedding ring caught the kitchen light each morning. Tomorrow, whatever happened, his life would be irrevocably different. The question was whether he had the courage to choose transformation over preservation, growth over safety. Thunder nickered softly outside the window, and Ben found himself smiling despite everything. That sound had become as familiar as his own heartbeat, a reminder that healing was possible, that trust could be earned, that wild things could choose to stay if they found what they were looking for. "All right," he said, reaching for the pen David had placed beside the documents. "Let's see what we can build together." But even as he spoke the words, Ben knew that the hardest part wasn't the decision, it was having the faith to live with the consequences. Dawn arrived with an unseasonable chill that made Ben's breath visible as he stepped onto his porch. The signed sanctuary agreement lay on his kitchen table, but the federal transport trucks would arrive within the hour, and he still wasn't certain which decision would govern the day's events. Thunder stood near the water trough, his head high and alert, as if he too sensed the importance of this morning. The rest of the herd had arranged themselves in their protective formation, but there was something different about their positioning, tighter, more defensive, as though they could sense approaching change. Ben's phone rang as he was filling his coffee cup with shaking hands. David Clearwater's voice carried the urgency of someone who had been awake most of the night. "Ben, the paperwork went through. The sanctuary designation is officially filed, but Dr. Chen's people are claiming it came too late. They're saying the transport order takes precedence. What does that mean? It means we're going to have to fight this out in real time, with the horses watching." 3 large transport trailers appeared on the horizon, followed by the now familiar convoy of government vehicles. Ben felt his heart rate spike as the reality of the confrontation settled on him. In his mind, he'd imagined a quiet, bureaucratic resolution. The sight of actual horse trailers made everything viscerally real. Dr. Chen emerged from the lead SUV with obvious determination, but her expression softened when she saw Ben waiting on his porch. "Mr. Carver, I want you to know that none of us take pleasure in this, but these animals are too important to risk in an uncontrolled environment." "The environment isn't uncontrolled," Ben replied, gesturing toward the herd. "Look at them. They've chosen their place, their protector, their way of life. That's not chaos, that's intelligence." Dr. Wayne joined the conversation, her clipboard already in hand. "Intelligence doesn't negate the need for genetic preservation protocols, Mr. Carver. These horses represent millions of years of evolutionary adaptation. We can't gamble that heritage on sentiment." David arrived in his pickup, bringing Sheriff Morrison and Dr. Rodriguez with him. The gathering felt like the prelude to a battle, with the horses as silent witnesses to the human drama unfolding around them. "Dr. Chen," David said, approaching with the confidence of someone who held winning cards. "I trust you received our filed sanctuary agreement?" "We did," Dr. Chen replied curtly, "and we're prepared to challenge it in federal court. Until that challenge is resolved, a relocation order stands." "Actually," Sheriff Morrison interjected, "that's not quite accurate." He produced a document from his jacket. "This is a temporary restraining order from the federal district court, preventing any action against these animals until the sanctuary status can be properly reviewed." Ben felt a surge of hope, but Dr. Chen's expression didn't change. "Sheriff, I appreciate your local authority, but federal wildlife management supersedes county jurisdiction. We have transport authorization from Washington. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but Thunder chose that moment to act." The stallion walked slowly toward the gathering of humans, his gait unhurried but purposeful. He stopped directly between the 2 groups, facing the transport trailers, and planted himself like a living barrier. One by one, the other horses began to move, not in panic or aggression, but with the same deliberate purpose Thunder had shown. They flowed across the pasture like a slow-moving river, positioning themselves in a line between the trailers and their leader. "Remarkable," Dr. Wayne whispered, her scientific training overriding her official position. "They're protecting him, not from predators or competing stallions, but from us." Majesty, the black mare, took a position at Thunder's right shoulder. Her age and dignity were unmistakable, and when she looked directly at Dr. Chen, there was something almost human in her gaze, a mother's fierce protectiveness mixed with aristocratic disdain. "They understand what's happening," Ben said quietly. "They know what those trailers mean." Dr. Chen stared at the line of horses blocking access to their leader, her professional composure beginning to crack. "We can work around them. The transport crew has experience with reluctant animals. You'll have to tranquilize them," Dr. Rodriguez said bluntly. "All of them. And even then, forcing wild animals into captivity against their will. Do you understand the psychological trauma that causes?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Dr. Chen's face. She looked from the horses to Ben, then to the growing crowd of onlookers who had gathered to witness the confrontation. News trucks had arrived, cameras rolling, and the story was being broadcast live across the region. "Dr. Chen," Ben said, stepping forward with Thunder's calm presence, giving him courage. "These animals made a choice. They chose to trust me, to stay here, to build something together. Doesn't that choice mean anything?" "Animals don't make informed decisions about conservation policy," Dr. Chen replied, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Maybe not," Ben acknowledged. "But they make decisions about where they belong, who they trust, what's worth protecting. And every day for the past 2 weeks, they've chosen this place." Thunder turned his great head toward Ben and nickered softly, a sound that somehow conveyed gratitude, trust, and an unshakable determination to remain exactly where he was. The moment that changed everything came not from the humans arguing policy and procedure, but from an 8-year-old girl who slipped past the police barrier and walked directly toward Thunder Emma Patterson, who had driven 3 hours with her mother to witness this confrontation, moved through the crowd of adults with the fearless determination that only children possess. Her mother's panicked call of "Emma, no!" seemed to hang in the morning air as the little girl approached the line of wild horses. "Emma, stop!" Dr. Chen commanded, but the child was already beyond the reach of adult authority. Thunder saw her coming. The great stallion turned his attention from the transport trailers to the small figure walking toward him with complete trust. When Emma reached out her hand, Thunder lowered his massive head and breathed softly against her palm. "He remembers me," Emma said, her clear voice carrying across the sudden silence. "He knows I'm his friend." The image was undeniable. A wild stallion, supposedly dangerous and unpredictable, accepting the gentle touch of a child while dozens of adults watched in breathless amazement. News cameras captured every second, and even the transport crew had stopped their preparations to stare. Dr. Chen looked from Emma to Thunder, then to Ben, her professional certainty visibly cracking. This is not standard protocol." "Maybe that's the point," Ben said gently. "Maybe standard protocol doesn't account for everything." Emma turned to face the crowd of adults, her small hand still resting on Thunder's neck. "Why do you want to take him away? He's happy here." "They're all happy here." The question, asked with a child's directness, seemed to slice through all the bureaucratic complexity and reach the heart of the matter. Dr. Wayne stepped forward, her voice unusually gentle. "Emma, these horses are very special. We want to make sure they're safe, that they have babies who will grow up healthy and strong." "But they are having babies," Emma replied, pointing toward a mare with a young foal at her side. "And they chose Mr. Ben to take care of them. Doesn't that count for something?" Dr. Chen's radio crackled with an incoming message. She listened intently, her expression shifting from determination to confusion to something that might have been relief. "Dr. Chen," David Clearwater said, approaching with a document in his hand, "I believe you're about to receive some updated instructions from Washington." The federal official finished her radio conversation and looked around at the assembled crowd. The horses maintaining their protective formation, the child standing fearlessly among wild animals, the cameras documenting every moment of an unprecedented standoff. "That was the Secretary of the Interior's office," she announced. "In light of the unique circumstances of this case and the significant public interest it has generated, they're willing to approve a trial period for the sanctuary designation." Ben felt his knees nearly buckle with relief. "What does that mean?" "It means you have 1 year to prove that these horses can contribute to conservation efforts while remaining in their chosen habitat," Dr. Chen explained, her professional composure returning now that she had clear instructions. "The sanctuary agreement will be honored, but with strict oversight and regular evaluation." Thunder nickered softly, as if he understood that the threat had passed. Around him, the other horses began to relax their defensive posture, though they remained close to their leader. Emma looked up at Thunder with obvious delight. "You get to stay," she said. "You get to stay with Mr. Ben forever." "Not forever," Ben knew. Nothing lasted forever. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. But for now, for this moment, for however long they were granted, the horses would remain free to make their own choices about where they belonged. Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward to examine Thunder's healed leg one more time, her professional satisfaction evident. "Remarkable recovery," she murmured. "Ben, whatever you did, it worked perfectly. I just didn't interfere with the healing," Ben replied. Sometimes that's the hardest thing to learn. As the transport trailers prepared to leave empty and the government officials packed away their relocation orders, Ben found himself surrounded by neighbors and strangers who had come to witness what many were already calling a miracle. But Ben knew it wasn't a miracle, it was simply the result of choosing compassion over control, trust over fear, healing over hiding. Thunder had taught him that broken things could become whole again, that isolation wasn't the same as safety, and that sometimes the greatest strength came from admitting you needed help. The herd began to disperse across the pasture, returning to their natural rhythms now that the crisis had passed. But Thunder remained near Ben, his presence a steady reminder of the partnership they'd forged and the responsibility they now shared. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, researchers to accommodate, educational programs to develop, visitors to guide through their first encounters with wild horses. But today had proven something Ben had almost forgotten, that with patience, respect, and courage, even the most impossible situations could transform into something beautiful. Emma's mother finally reached her daughter, scooping her up with relief and exasperation. But as they walked back toward their car, Emma looked over her shoulder at Ben and Thunder. "Thank you for saving them," she called out. Ben waved back, understanding that salvation had flowed in both directions. The horses had saved him just as surely as he'd saved them. 6 months later, Ben stood in the same spot where he'd first discovered Thunder collapse by the water trough. But the world around him had transformed in ways he never could have imagined. The weathered stone basin still held fresh water, but now it served as the centerpiece of what visitors had begun calling the sanctuary, a place where wild horses lived free and humans learned what partnership with nature could look like. The morning routine had evolved to accommodate both solitude and purpose. Ben still rose before dawn, still made his coffee in Martha's kitchen, still slipped his wedding ring onto his finger as the sun painted the valley in gold and amber light. But now his mornings included checking on 2 graduate students who lived in the small cabin David's organization had built near the barn, reviewing the day's educational visits, and consulting with Dr. Rodriguez about the health of 3 new foals born since spring. Thunder approached as Ben filled the water trough, the stallion's presence still as comforting as it had been that first night 6 months ago. The injury that had brought them together was now just a faint scar, barely visible unless you knew where to look. But the bond they'd forged remained as strong as ever, a partnership built on mutual respect and sustained by daily choice. "Morning, friend," Ben murmured, his hand finding the familiar warmth of Thunder's neck. Big day today. The herd had grown to 53 horses with the addition of 2 small family groups that had joined them in late spring. The newcomers had been accepted with the same deliberate grace that characterized everything about Majesty's leadership. She was getting older. Dr. Rodriguez estimated her age at 22, but her authority remained absolute and her wisdom undeniable. Sarah Chen, one of the graduate students studying the herd's social dynamics, emerged from the cabin with her daily observation notes. The young woman had been skeptical when she first arrived, convinced that semi-domesticated horses couldn't provide meaningful data about wild behavior. 6 months of watching the herd's sophisticated social interactions had changed her perspective entirely. "Ben," she called out, "you need to see what Thunder did yesterday evening." She showed him video footage captured by the motion-activated cameras placed around the property. In the recording, a young colt had become separated from his mother during a thunderstorm and was calling frantically in the darkness. Thunder had found the lost foal and guided him back to the herd. not with force or dominance, but with the patient leadership of someone who understood that every member of the community mattered. "He's not just healing physically," Sarah observed. "He's teaching the other stallions. Watch how he handles conflict resolution, how he protects without intimidating, how he leads through example rather than aggression." Ben nodded, remembering Martha's words about horses being smarter than most people realized. Thunder had become more than a rescued animal. He was an ambassador for his species, demonstrating what wild horses could accomplish when they felt safe enough to express their full intelligence. The morning's first visitor was Emma Patterson, now 9 years old, and a regular volunteer who helped guide younger children through their first encounters with the horses. She'd convinced her parents to drive up from Billings every other weekend, and Ben had watched her confidence bloom as she learned to read the subtle signs of equine communication. "Mr. Ben," Emma called out, running toward him with the boundless energy of childhood. "Guess what? Thunder let me brush his mane yesterday, and Sarah says that means he really trusts me." "That's quite an honor," Ben agreed solemnly. "Thunder doesn't let just anyone tend to his appearance." As if summoned by his name, Thunder moved closer and lowered his head so Emma could stroke his forehead. The gesture never failed to amaze the adults who witnessed it. A wild stallion, allowing a child to touch him with complete trust. The day brought its usual rhythm of activity. A school group from Missoula arrived for their scheduled educational visit. 23rd graders wide-eyed with wonder as Ben explained how to approach wild horses with respect. Dr. Rodriguez stopped by to check on a mare who was expecting her first foal. David Clearwater called with updates on federal funding that would allow them to expand their educational programs. But it was during the quiet evening hours, after the visitors had departed and the graduate students had retreated to their cabin, that Ben found his deepest satisfaction. He would sit on his porch, Martha's chair beside him, still empty but no longer painful, and watch the herd settle into their nighttime routines. Thunder often grazed near the house during these evening hours, close enough for conversation, but free to move wherever instinct called him. Sometimes Ben would share the day's events with the stallion, finding that speaking his thoughts aloud helped him process the remarkable changes in his life. "You know," he said to Thunder one evening as autumn painted the cottonwoods gold, "I spent 3 years thinking grief was something to carry alone. Turns out it was something to carry forward." Thunder raised his head from grazing and looked at Ben with those ancient knowing eyes. In their depths, Ben saw recognition of a truth they'd both learned, that healing wasn't about forgetting the past or replacing what was lost, but about finding the courage to build something new while honoring what came before. The water trough gleamed in the fading light, its weathered stone surface bearing witness to the cycle of seasons and the passage of time. It had been there when Ben and Martha first built their dream, had remained when grief nearly destroyed him, and now served as the foundation for a purpose he never could have imagined. As stars began to appear over the Bitterroot Valley, Ben reflected on the unexpected trajectory of his life. 6 months ago, he'd been a man alone with his memories, tending a ranch that existed more as monument than living enterprise. Now he was part of something larger, a guardian, a teacher, a partner in an ongoing experiment in trust between species. The horses settled into their nighttime arrangement, some sleeping, others maintaining watch, all secure in their chosen sanctuary. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new visitors, new opportunities to demonstrate that wildness and wisdom could coexist when approached with respect and patience. But tonight, as the mountain air carried the soft sounds of contented horses and the distant call of a great horned owl, Ben Carver sat on his porch and felt something he hadn't experienced since Martha's death. He felt like he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Thunder nickered softly in the darkness, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat, and Ben smiled. Some partnerships, he realized, were worth waiting a lifetime to discover.